The Battle of Tannenberg, 1914. In the opening weeks of the war, Russia mobilized faster than Germany expected and sent two armies into East Prussia. The first under General Pavel Rennenkampf advancing from the northeast, the second under General Alexander Samsonov pushing from the southwest with the plan to crush the German 8th Army between them. The two Russian commanders despised each other personally, a grudge dating back to the Russo-Japanese War, and barely coordinated. The Germans, helped by Russian radio operators transmitting battle plans unencrypted because they lacked sufficient codebooks, intercepted everything. German commanders Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, using a plan devised primarily by staff officer Maximilian Hoffmann, gambled everything on the assumption that Rennenkampf would not move to support Samsonov in time. They left a single cavalry screen facing Rennenkampf's army and turned the entire 8th Army south against Samsonov. Between August 26th and 30th, 1914, German corps under Generals Hermann von Francois and August von Mackensen attacked Samsonov's flanks simultaneously, completing a pincer movement around the bulk of the Russian Second Army near the village of Fruggenau. The trapped Russian center was pounded by artillery for a full day while the encirclement closed. Soldiers attempting to break out by running across open fields were cut down by machine guns and rifle fire. According to multiple historical accounts, many Russian soldiers simply threw down their weapons and surrendered rather than continue the slaughter. Of the approximately 150,000 men in Samsonov's army, only around 10,000 escaped. Casualty estimates vary by source, but the consistent core figures are approximately 50,000 Russian dead and wounded, and over 90,000 taken prisoner. Entire corps captured wholesale, 60 trainloads of equipment shipped back to Germany. Samsonov, unable to face reporting the scale of the disaster to Tsar Nicholas II, rode alone into the forest on the night of August 29th and shot himself. His body was recovered by a German search party and given a military burial by the men who had destroyed his army. Hindenburg named the battle after the village of Tannenberg, 30 kilometers from the actual fighting, specifically to invoke the Teutonic Knights' defeat there 500 years earlier, turning a modern catastrophe into deliberate historical revenge. Russia's military reputation never recovered. Historians trace a direct line from the humiliation of Tannenberg to the collapse of morale that fed the Russian Revolution 3 years later. The Battle of Passchendaele, 1917. Field Marshal Douglas Haig wanted to break out of the Ypres salient, capture the Belgian ports the German Navy was using for submarine warfare, and reach the railway junction that supplied the German front. He had studied 80 years of weather records for Flanders and concluded the region's wet season broke reliably in early August. He launched the offensive on July 31st, 1917, after a 2-week bombardment that fired 4.5 million shells from over 3,000 guns. It began to rain that same day and barely stopped for 3 months. The bombardment had already destroyed the region's centuries-old drainage system, built up over generations to reclaim swampland from the sea. With nowhere for the water to go and the heaviest rainfall in decades falling almost continuously, the battlefield became, in the words of contemporary witnesses, a lake of mud capable of swallowing men whole. Soldiers carrying full equipment who slipped off the wooden duckboard paths could sink and drown in shell craters filled with water and mud, not from enemy fire, but from the ground itself. According to the account preserved by the Imperial War Museum, it took 6 men to carry a single wounded soldier across the glue-like surface on a stretcher. Moving a single field gun 250 yards required 6 hours of continuous effort. 300 tanks became permanently stuck and were abandoned where they sank. The attack on October 12, 1917, was launched in pouring rain despite a British officer's written protest that it could not succeed. It did not. Troops advanced barely 50 yards before becoming stuck. The New Zealand Division alone suffered 2,700 casualties in that single attack, more than 840 killed, which remains to this day the greatest single-day military disaster in New Zealand's history. Canadian forces finally captured the ruined village of Passchendaele itself on November 6th, after their own commander, General Arthur Currie, had formally objected that the assault would cost approximately 16,000 Canadian casualties for negligible strategic value. He was overruled and ordered to proceed. His estimate was almost exactly correct. Total Allied casualties across the full 3.5-month campaign reached approximately 300,000, with around 70,000 dead. German losses are estimated as high or higher. Over 60% of the Allied dead at Passchendaele have no known grave. They were lost entirely in the mud, their bodies never recovered. The ground gained was abandoned to German recapture the following spring. Hague's reputation never fully recovered. The poet Siegfried Sassoon, who fought there, wrote simply, "I died in hell." They called it Passchendaele. The Battle of Gallipoli, 1915 to 1916. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, proposed a plan that looked elegant on paper: force the Dardanelles straight with naval power, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, open a supply route to Russia through the Black Sea, and avoid the static slaughter already developing on the Western Front. The naval assault in March 1915 failed when Allied ships struck an undetected minefield, sinking 3 battleships in a single day. The plan shifted to a land invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula instead, a decision that traded one failure for a longer and bloodier one. On April 25, 1915, British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops landed on beaches under steep cliffs that Ottoman defenders, commanded in part by a then unknown colonel named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, founder of modern Turkey, had fortified with machine guns positioned to cover every approach. The Anzac forces landed at the wrong beach entirely, in darkness, at a location surrounded by cliffs far steeper than intended, under fire from the moment their boats touched sand. Men drowned wading ashore under their own equipment weight, while bullets churned the water around them. What followed was 8 months of trench warfare conducted on a narrow mountainous peninsula in summer heat that produced dysentery and disease on a scale that killed nearly as many men as combat did. Water was desperately scarce. The trenches at some points were separated from Ottoman positions by only a few meters, close enough that soldiers on both sides could hear each other's conversations, occasionally throwing cigarettes and canned food across to each other during brief, unofficial truces before resuming the killing. The campaign was abandoned in January 1916, after achieving none of its strategic objectives. Total Allied casualties reached approximately 250,000. Ottoman casualties were comparable, estimated at around 250,000 to 300,000. The evacuation itself, conducted under cover of darkness using deception techniques including self-firing rifles rigged with dripping water to simulate continued occupation, was the only unambiguous success of the entire campaign, executed so well that Ottoman forces did not realize the trenches were empty until well after the last boats had departed. For Australia and New Zealand, the disaster at Gallipoli became paradoxically a founding national memory. April 25th is still commemorated as Anzac Day, the day their young nations were, in the local telling, forged through catastrophic loss on a foreign beach in a campaign that should never have happened the way it did. The Brusilov Offensive, 1916. The Brusilov Offensive was, by the calculation of most military historians, the most successful Allied offensive of the entire First World War, and one of the deadliest, on a scale that has been largely overshadowed in Western memory by the Somme and Verdun. Fought simultaneously on the other side of the continent, General Alexei Brusilov, commanding the Russian Southwestern Front, proposed something tactically unprecedented for the era. Rather than concentrating his entire force at a single breakthrough point, the standard approach that allowed defenders to mass their own reserves against the obvious threat, he attacked across a broad 400-kilometer front simultaneously, using short, precise artillery bombardments instead of the prolonged barrages that telegraphed an attack's location for days in advance. The offensive began on June 4, 1916, against Austro-Hungarian positions in Galicia, in what is now western Ukraine. The Austro-Hungarian army, already weakened by previous campaigns and increasingly dependent on German reinforcement to function, collapsed across large sections of the front within days. Brusilov's forces advanced up to 75 miles in places, captured approximately 400,000 Austro-Hungarian prisoners in the campaign's first phase alone, and came close to knocking Austria-Hungary out of the war entirely. The offensive forced Germany to divert significant forces from the Western Front to stabilize its collapsing ally, a diversion that directly relieved pressure on French forces simultaneously bleeding to death at Verdun. The cost was enormous on both sides. Austro-Hungarian casualties across the full offensive, including prisoners, are estimated at around 1.5 million. Russian casualties are estimated at approximately 500,000 to 1 million, depending on the source and the period counted. The Russian army that achieved this victory was also the army that, exhausted and bled white by the effort, would begin disintegrating into mutiny and revolution within the following year. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, militarily humiliated and forced into permanent dependence on German support, never recovered its independent fighting capacity for the remainder of the war. The offensive that should be remembered as one of history's most successful military operations is, in most popular accounts of the First World War, barely mentioned at all. The First Battle of the Marne, 1914. By early September 1914, the German army's opening offensive, the Schlieffen Plan, designed to sweep through Belgium and northern France and encircle Paris before Russia could fully mobilize in the east, had advanced to within 30 miles of the French capital. French forces had already conducted a desperate fighting retreat across hundreds of kilometers. The government had relocated to Bordeaux. Paris was preparing for a siege that many believed would end the war on German terms within weeks. French commander Joseph Joffre, supported by British Expeditionary Force units under Field Marshal Sir John French, identified a critical gap that had opened between two German armies as they wheeled toward Paris, a gap created by a last-minute change of direction ordered by German commander Alexander von Kluck, who had turned his army east of Paris rather than encircling it from the west, exposing his own flank in the process. Joffre ordered a counteroffensive along the Marne River beginning September 5, 1914. The battle that followed, fought across a front of over 100 miles for 6 days, became famous for a detail that captured public imagination on both sides of the war. The military governor of Paris, General Joseph Gallieni, requisitioned approximately 600 Parisian taxicabs to ferry reinforcements, roughly 6,000 soldiers, from the city to the front lines near the Marne. The taxis carried only a fraction of the total forces engaged, and historians have noted their tactical contribution was modest compared to their symbolic and propaganda value. But the image of Parisian taxis driving soldiers to save their own capital became one of the enduring legends of the war's opening. The German advance was stopped. Both sides dug in. The trench lines established in the aftermath of the Marne would barely move in either direction for the next 3.5 years, hardening into the static Western Front that would define the rest of the war. Casualties across both sides during the 6-day battle are estimated at over 500,000. The Schlieffen Plan's central premise, a quick knockout of France before Russia could mobilize, had failed permanently. The war Germany had planned to win in 6 weeks would now last over 4 years. The Battle of Caporetto, 1917. The Italian front along the Isonzo River had seen 11 separate, largely indecisive Italian offensives against entrenched Austro-Hungarian positions since 1915, each producing enormous casualties for minimal territorial gain. A pattern of attrition that had exhausted Italian forces both physically and psychologically. In October 1917, Austria-Hungary, reinforced by German divisions transferred from the Eastern Front following Russia's collapse, launched a counteroffensive designed to break the stalemate permanently. The attack, beginning October 24, 1917, near the town of Caporetto, employed tactics that Italian commanders had not encountered at this scale. A brief, precisely targeted bombardment using gas and high explosive, followed immediately by specially trained infiltration units, German stormtroopers among them, who bypassed strong points entirely and pushed deep into the Italian rear before the defenders had time to organize a coherent response. The Italian Second Army, holding the critical sector, collapsed within hours. What began as a tactical breakthrough became a general rout. The Italian retreat covered over 70 miles in a matter of days, one of the largest single retreats by any army in the war. Total Italian losses across the battle are estimated at over 600,000. The overwhelming majority of them prisoners and deserters rather than combat casualties, approximately 275,000 captured and an estimated 300,000 more simply walking away from their units in the chaos. The Italian commander Luigi Cadorna was removed from his post within weeks, replaced by General Armando Diaz, whose more cautious leadership eventually stabilized a new defensive line along the Piave River, where Italian forces, reinforced by British and French divisions rushed from the Western Front, finally held. The defeat was so catastrophic that the word Caporetto entered the Italian language as a synonym for total, humiliating collapse, still used in everyday Italian conversation over a century later to describe any disaster of overwhelming scale, military or otherwise. The Battle of Jutland, 1916. Jutland was the only full-scale clash between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet during the entire war, the largest naval battle in history up to that point, involving 250 ships and approximately 100,000 sailors across both sides. Both navies had spent the previous 2 years building dreadnought battleships at enormous expense specifically for an engagement like this one. When it finally happened on May 31st and June 1st, 1916, in the North Sea off the coast of Denmark, it lasted barely 36 hours and resolved almost nothing. German Admiral Reinhard Scheer used a smaller force under Franz Hipper as bait to draw the British battlecruiser fleet under David Beatty into range of the main German fleet. The plan partially worked. In the opening engagement, British battlecruisers Indefatigable and Queen Mary were struck in their ammunition magazines and exploded catastrophically, each sinking within minutes, taking virtually their entire crews down with them. Over 2,000 men killed in 2 single explosions. A third British battlecruiser, Invincible, was destroyed the same way later in the battle. British naval design had prioritized speed over armor protection in its battlecruisers, a trade-off that proved fatal when German shells found their ammunition stores. The main fleets engaged briefly as night fell, with German ships using superior optical equipment and trained night-fighting doctrine to inflict additional losses while extracting themselves from a numerically superior British force and returning to port. Britain lost 14 ships and approximately 6,100 sailors. Germany lost 11 ships and approximately 2,500 sailors, a tactical loss ratio that German propaganda celebrated as a victory. Strategically, nothing changed. The German High Seas Fleet returned to port and rarely ventured out again for the rest of the war, leaving British naval supremacy and the blockade of Germany intact. The blockade that would, over the following 2 years, contribute to the starvation and economic collapse that helped force Germany's eventual surrender. Both sides claimed victory. Neither fleet would fight a battle of this scale again. The Battle of Verdun, 1916. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn conceived Verdun not as a battle to win territory, but as a machine designed to kill Frenchmen faster than France could replace them. He called it forcing the French army to bleed itself white. Verdun, an ancient fortress city that had been the last French stronghold to fall in 1870, was a symbol so tied to national pride that abandoning it without a fight was politically impossible. Ant Mini Europe. The attack began at 4 a.m. on February 21, 1916, with a 9-hour bombardment from over 1,000 guns, followed by the German Fifth Army's advance under Crown Prince Wilhelm. 5 days in, German forces captured Fort Douaumont, the largest of the 19 forts protecting the city, taken so easily that news of its fall triggered celebrations and a school holiday in Germany. Egypt Museum Wikipedia. General Philippe Pétain took command and built the defense around one principle: hold the line, whatever the cost. With rail lines cut, the French depended on a single road from Bar-le-Duc, a 37-mile track known as La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, kept running by a fleet of over 3,000 trucks, moving men and supplies forward without pause. Egypt Museum. 10 months of attrition followed across ground reduced to mud and craters. Fort Vaux fell to the Germans in June after its garrison ran out of water. Le Mort Homme, the dead man, was fought over for months without resolution. German troops advancing down the east bank were repeatedly cut down from the flank by French guns positioned across the river. Historic Mysteries Falkenhayn was removed from command in August 1916. The French counteroffensive in October, combining heavy bombardment with fast infantry assaults, retook Fort Douaumont the same day it began, and Fort Vaux in November. A final push in December drove the German line back nearly to where it had started. Across 302 days, the two armies suffered nearly 700,000 combined casualties, roughly 2,300 men killed or wounded every day for almost a year. The front line at the end sat within a few miles of where it began. The Douaumont ossuary holds the mixed, unidentifiable bones of at least 130,000 French and German soldiers, men from both sides sharing the same building because the artillery had made them impossible to separate. History Wikipedia. Pétain became a national hero for the defense, the Lion of Verdun. A generation later, he led France's collaborationist Vichy government and was convicted of treason. The Battle of Megiddo, 1918. By September 1918, the war in Europe was visibly approaching its end, but the Ottoman Empire's collapse in the Middle East had not yet been finalized. British General Edmund Allenby, commanding forces in Palestine that included the famous Arab revolt forces coordinated by T.E. Lawrence, planned an offensive designed to destroy what remained of organized Ottoman resistance in the region permanently. Taking its name deliberately from Megiddo, the ancient battlefield referenced in the Book of Revelation as the site of Armageddon, Allenby used deliberate deception extensively before the attack, including dummy camps, fake cavalry made from canvas and wood, and a deceptive pattern of troop movements that convinced Ottoman commanders the main assault would come from an entirely different direction than the one actually planned. When the real offensive launched on September 19, 1918, it caught Ottoman and German forces almost completely unprepared. British cavalry exploited gaps in the collapsed Ottoman line with a speed that infantry-dominated warfare on the Western Front had rarely achieved. Advancing deep into Ottoman territory and cutting off entire armies from retreat, the Ottoman 7th and 8th armies were effectively destroyed as organized fighting forces within days. Approximately 75,000 Ottoman and German troops were captured, along with massive quantities of equipment, for British and Allied losses that numbered only in the low thousands, one of the most lopsided victories of the entire war. The campaign continued through October, taking Damascus and pushing toward Aleppo, effectively ending organized Ottoman military resistance. The Ottoman government signed an armistice on October 30, 1918, less than 2 weeks before Germany itself surrendered on the Western Front. The empire that had ruled the Middle East for 6 centuries effectively ended its military existence in a battle named with what proved to be uncomfortable historical irony after the place the Bible names as the site of the world's final war. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now. The Battle of Vimy Ridge, 1917. Vimy Ridge had defeated every previous French assault since 1914, at a cost of well over 100,000 casualties, and German commanders considered it essentially impregnable. 7 kilometers of high ground honeycombed with tunnels, concrete machine gun nests, and overlapping fields of fire. In April 1917, the task fell to the 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps, fighting together for the first time as a unified force under British General Julian Byng with Canadian Major General Arthur Currie central to the planning. The preparation broke sharply from the approach that had produced the Somme. Canadian planners built scale models of the ridge so every soldier could study the terrain before the attack. Engineers dug subway tunnels beneath no man's land so troops could approach close to German lines without crossing open ground under fire. Canadian gunners refined the creeping barrage, a precisely timed wall of artillery advancing just ahead of the infantry, keeping defenders pinned in their shelters until the attackers were almost on top of them. The assault launched at 5:30 a.m. on April 9, 1917, Easter Monday, in sleet blowing directly into German faces. Following the barrage with disciplined precision, Canadian troops took the first 2 German lines within hours and most of the ridge by nightfall. Hill 145, the highest point, held out until April 10th, taken without artillery support after a planned bombardment failed to arrive. The final position, a knoll called the Pimple, fell April 12th in driving snow. The Canadian Corps suffered approximately 10,600 casualties, including 3,598 dead. A heavy toll, but a battle won in days where previous attempts had failed for years. German losses were comparable, with roughly 4,000 taken prisoner. For the first time, all 4 Canadian divisions had fought side by side, succeeding where established European armies had repeatedly failed. The wider war continued for another 19 months, with the front barely moving elsewhere. But Vimy became, for generations of Canadians, the moment their country was said to have come of age as a nation distinct from Britain. The twin pylon monument on Hill 145, unveiled in 1936, lists 11,285 Canadian soldiers killed in France with no known grave.